Hi, my name is Emmanuel. This is my second PowerPoint for creative project, and for my creative project, I'm doing podcast. So, on this development stage of this project, I'm going to talk about achievable timescales and deadlines of legal constraints and implications, cost parameters, and task activities. I'm gonna go over them really quickly. I am using my Gantt chart for the help to get done all the aims and objectives for this project, which I have one aim and six objectives. Legal constraints and implications. I was doing my research, I found only five, which are intellectual law, copyright law, privacy law, public domain law, PRS and PPL, which are for the music in your podcast. The cost parameters. I summed up everything I'm using, what I bought just in the beginning of my college, and it all summed up to £1,133. Task activities, I would say there are about 7 steps, which is planning, scripting, editing, research, recording, adding music, and publishing. So, the project brief. This is a little recap of my first project PowerPoint. In my previous project, I mentioned that when I started my research for the podcast, I thought it was easy until I fully dived into the legal side of research, like copyright laws and other legal restrictions. Now, I'm almost finished with that research, and now most of my research is focused on the Beatles, which is the theme of my podcast. I am exploring behind the scenes stories, funny anecdotes about Beatles, and interesting information about them that could be added into the podcast. Additionally, I'm considering the ideal duration for my podcast, as because I discovered that most listeners prefer to listen to podcasts from 20 to 25 minutes. So, achievable timescale and deadlines. For my timescales, I'm using Gantt chart, which I have one aim and seven objectives, and I'm going to list them with the timescales, of course, and you can see there's a picture with my objective and the aim. For my first objective, that is planning side of things for the podcast, it is done, nearly done already. So before, and it comes very first, since most of it is done, as I said, and it comes before uh, filming, of course, the podcast. Second objectives is writing down the script for podcast, which will be done also before filming takes place. The third objective is determining the length of the podcast, which will be done also before the filming of the podcast. All the first three objectives will be done in the same week before filming the podcast, and they will follow us. Planning of the uh, side of the podcast will be first, then the scripting, and then determining the length of the podcast. Fourth objective, which will be right after, is filming. Then a week after filming, the fifth objective comes in with posting and publishing the podcast. The sixth objective is placed in the same timeline as the filming of the podcast, since before posting the podcast, I would like to make an announcement saying the podcast will soon come out. Please keep your notifications on and stuff like that. The seventh objective will be on the last week after the podcast is posted, and then I can start promoting, because I can look how the post podcast came out, and I can make assumptions of how I'm going to do the right marketing and promotion for the podcast. So the sixth objective would be, which I'm going to say soon, is going to become out the podcast, so they know when to watch it, and the seventh objective would be the last, when the podcast is already done, posted, then I can plan on marketing the podcast. So, resource requirements. So, as I said, my aim on the Gantt chart, I have one aim and 7 objectives, which are plan the content and format of my podcast episodes, scripting, determine the length of my podcast, film the podcast, post the podcast, set a timeline for publishing my podcast on different social medias, plan promotion, marketing strategy for my podcast. As I said, most of it is done like determining the length of the podcast, or planning and researching side of the podcast. So yeah. Legal constraints and implications. There are 5 or 4 copyright laws and legal restraints for podcasts that I found out. The first one is intellectual law, which means when you have a great idea, you don't want anyone to steal it, or you don't want anyone to steal your content. Privacy law, which means not everything is good to be discussed on my podcast. Public domain law, which means when you post something online on the internet, you are holding responsibility on what you post there, because people see it and they can use that against you and stuff. Copyright law, that's where you cannot use or copy someone else's work or idea without their consent. And PRS or PPL, which basically, if you have license with them and you use some artist's music in your podcast, they will track how long the song, the duration of the song, and how many people listen to the song, and they will pay the fair amount of royalties to the artist or the people who wrote the song. The cost parameters. So the whole set cost me about £1,133. I have mic, which costs £100, for about 5 cables to connect everything to the mixer, and laptop, which is about £40, 2 cameras, which is £600, laptop £130, mini controller called Auto Mixer, about £263. It all sums up to £1,133. You can see the picture here. Task activities. So, as I said, my point of view, there are about 7 steps for the task activities, which is planning, scripting, editing, research, recording, adding music, and publishing. The recording process most likely will be done with a producer that helps me with everything and that offered to help me film it. The producer will help me film it, record it, and edit it. The whole process of filming and editing the footage will be with the help of my professional producer, who has done it many times. So today we were talking about achievable timescales and deadlines, resource requirements, legal constraints and implications, cost parameter, task activities. And if you have any questions, please do let me know, and I'll hope I have the answer for them. Thank you.